am currently a professor in the School of Social Communication. I've been here since May 2020. Before that, I did my PhD at McGill University in Montreal, and I did a couple of what we call postdocs. They're sort of longer research residencies that you do at different institutions. I did one at the Université de Montréal and one in Turku in Finland. And then I was lucky to get this job and to start here at St. Paul, and I'm very happy here. My research interests globally have to do with anything that is visual media, so mostly film, but also video games. And I'm interested in particular in two areas. I'm really interested in what the materiality of media is and what happens to that materiality when we move to an online world. And this is something that we're all very concerned with now because most of our lives happen on this little device, right? And also on this bigger device that is the computer. But we're very, very used to existing in a networked environment and almost also an augmented environment. If you think about it, if you're driving in your car, you're not just driving in a mechanical engine, you're actually using a very large computer these days, and you're often using your phone at the same time, and this is helping you navigate. This is an experience we're very used to. And we talk about new media as being dematerialized, but actually they have a materiality of their own. And so this is something I'm really interested in studying. The other thing I'm really interested in studying in media is how sexuality, so the way that women, for instance, are represented in media contents, or people who belong to sexual minorities, things like that. How are these people represented in films, in video games? How do we as a society, as a culture, think about the ways that we present people within media? What kind of repercussions do these representations have on our own society, on the way it changes, and so on? So these are, broadly speaking, the two areas that I'm especially invested in. So what I'm going to do today is that in the half-hour time that I have to talk to you a little bit, I'm going to give you a little taste of the sort of content that we look at when we take communications courses at St. Paul. I'm going to present to you an outtake from the introductory session for a course that we offer every year, which is called Introduction to New Media. And which treats precisely this first issue that I was talking about. So what exactly are new media? And so this is where I'm going to switch here a little bit into lecturing mode, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about this question. So the first thing I really want to start with is that we use this phrase new media in a very casual way. We use it synonymously with digital media. So we always say, oh, you know, we live in a new media world, we live in a new media environment. What do we actually mean when we talk about this newness? What is new about new media? New as compared to what? And when you start asking this question, the first thing you have to really interrogate is actually what it is you're meaning when you're thinking about the word medium. So medium has a long history as a word. It comes from the Latin, where it designates the idea of the middle ground or the center or an interval between things. Here you see I've taken out the definition from the Merriam-Webster dictionary, and you can see how many different elements there are in this definition. And it's only in the third position that you find media as relating to channels or systems of communication or information or entertainment. So the way that we often use the term media today. In particular, in the past, in the last few decades, people talked a lot about mass media. By mass media, people meant the radio, television, a single source that was able to reach a lot of people. Today, with the internet, we've entered a new age where everyone is on the internet and everyone is participating in the creation of the medium. So something here is shifting. But this idea that I want us to take from this definition, that still remains very central. The medium is always something that creates a connection between two things, two people, a person and a machine, a person and a process, right? There is a tendency to get confused when one talks about the plural of media. One talks about media in general. Sometimes people also talk about mediums. I like to use this as a fun example to sort of talk about how the word medium is also conceptualized in different ways. So of course, a medium is a person you go to when you want to communicate with the other world, right? So you go to a person who has a crystal ball and looks into it. This is a medium as well. And again, you have this idea, right, of someone who is creating a link between one element and another. In that case, the world of the living and then the afterworld. So when we talk about media and plural, that is the proper way to talk about many media and the way that we understand media as in mass media. The plural mediums is something you sometimes hear in popular speaking, but it actually means many people who are mediums, many people who communicate with the afterlife. So this is just a small thing. Professors often have pet peeves, and mine is to kind of find students who will talk about the mediums of radio and film. The way we tend to think of this is as media. So again, what is meant by new, or how is newness constructed in this respect? Well, newness, if you think about it, carries a lot of connotations, right? So for instance, there's the idea that what is new is necessarily better or avant-garde or state-of-the-art, that it's necessarily equivalent to progress. In a Western dominant kind of narrative, we, especially since industrialization, so since the invention of factories, the possibility to produce a lot of things identical to each other in a standardized process that is always geared towards going faster, being better, etc., we are very invested in the idea of newness. There's a real progress narrative, an idea that newness carries with it an idea of hopefulness. So associated with these ideas of being better, there's the idea of improvement, of increased opportunities, that we're necessarily going to be faster, smarter. If you think about the ways we're being sold the devices that we own, they are supposed to be smart, and they get smarter with every new iteration. But newness also implies change. So the idea that there are big shifts happening, and that media can be participant of these shifts, that it is the newness, the fastness of media that is going to have an impact on the way that we organize society politically, economically, socially, etc. Another change that has happened has been the one from modernity to post-modernity. So from a world that was invested in linear progress and a dominant narrative to a world more recently where different things coexist at the same time, in particular, many different media forms. If you think about it, we haven't thrown away vinyl. Some people still collect it, but we also listen to Spotify. Some people still listen to cassette tapes. Other people still like CDs. So every medium that we've had at one point tends to stay with us, but new ones get added on. And then, of course, we have the internet that is a globalized medium and that also aggregates all of the pre-existent media into itself. So on the internet, we can watch films, we can listen to contents, we can listen to the radio, we can read the news. The internet is a sort of super medium where all different media are being subsumed. So another change that is implied is the idea that media are going to lead us into a knowledge or information age, which we're already deeply ensconced in with the arrival of the internet. But this is something that we associate with the narrative of the arrival of new media. So again, here I am with my question, what is it exactly that is new about new media? Here are some old images of the first computers. You can see that they would take up entire rooms. Then we had that first here at the bottom left, sad little thing that was the first personal computer that arrived to people's homes in 1984. So at the time, those were definitely new media, right? But now we're in 2023, so we're 40 years forward, and we still call digital media new. So why are we so invested in this idea of newness? Because computers and the internet have radically changed the way that we conceive of information, in particular, the idea that we can store and retrieve information extremely quickly. And that is something that before computers, we just weren't able to do. So that is one way that new media have radically changed the way that we interact with the world. There's also been, therefore, a new relationship between what we call computation, so the use of digital media and the translation of contents into digital media, and the act of being creative. Once you have a computer, it opens up endless possibilities for creativity that you didn't necessarily have before. There's a new relationship to our bodies. And this is something I was touching on a little bit at the beginning of the presentation, where we go through the world at this point with small computers attached to us at almost all times. Most people have a smartphone at this point, and many people have other devices that are also connected, like an Apple Watch. And these devices are helping us navigate the world. They're constantly giving us data, information about the world, like what traffic is like, what the weather is like, and so on. They're also collecting a lot of data about us and about our bodies. Some people even wear their Apple Watch to sleep, and then it tells them about the quality of sleep they had. So there's a real kind of integration between human bodies and the technologies that we use. And that necessarily is going to lead to very, very radical changes. It's already in the process of doing it. And one of them is the idea that more and more we come to rely on the artificial intelligence of devices to exist in the world and for them to do some of our jobs for us. This is something lately in the news. I'm sure you've seen a lot of talk about an artificial intelligence called ChatGPT. That is the sort of thing that is of great concern to us at the moment, that we're in a fast accelerating moment when it comes to developing artificial intelligence and using it, and what are the ethical questions that this then raises. This means that we're developing new notions of cultural identity, of human identity, of species identity almost. If I'm constantly connected to digital devices, am I really still human? Am I not some people call this then post-human, where I am an augmented human who relies on machines in a very, very fundamental way, to the point that this could almost alter the very fabric of human existence. If you think about the very, very advanced methods in assisted procreation that we have now, there is already this very augmented element at work. So all this means, philosophically speaking, that we now have a very different way of relating to space and time. This idea that we live an augmented life, so a life that is augmented by technology, by the presence of technology, means that we're able to, for instance, exist in some ways in different places at the same time. I can be walking down the street in Tokyo, but speaking to someone who is in New Delhi. And that would never have been possible in the same way before digital media. There's also new ways of distributing and creating cultural contents. So we're able to circulate contents much more quickly. And this is going to also have an effect on how we live our lives and how we develop as a culture. Different ways of perceiving the world. I can go on Google Street View and I can have a real impression of what a city looks like that I've never set foot in a way that is very close to a virtual reality experience. And of course, there are very, very new ways of socializing, of forming and conceiving of the notion of community. This was radically altered by the emergence of something like Facebook. And now, again, this is changing with a lot of questions being asked about Facebook and about the future of social media. Social media, of course, are also at this point a primary tool in some of the jobs that people might be interested in doing when they're taking a communication studies degree. Something like marketing at this point relies very, very strongly on social media. So understanding where social media come from and the history of what shaped them is going to also give us a better sense of how to use them or what direction we might want to take them in. And this means that we also have completely new ways of working and of organizing labor. So with the arrival of the internet, we have created centralized platforms where anyone can contribute. And this form of sort of crowdsourcing or outsourcing labor to a very vast population is bringing with it very significant changes that go beyond the changes that the industrial era had brought. So if in the industrial era, at the turn of the 20th century, we had factories, and the novelty was that a worker could go into the factory, perform the same task over and over and over again, and be part of a very large production chain of a very large amount of objects, in particular automobiles. Those were some of the first industries that were produced. Then today, what we have is a different kind of organization of labor, but it is still labor. So there are still questions here that are tied to what kind of work can humans do? What kind of work should humans do? How do we ethically think of this work? What are good working conditions? And so on. So the new characteristics of digital media should be beginning to emerge at this point, right? So there is this question of whether the idea of newness even actually provides a good frame of analysis. As I was showing in that previous image, new media have always been new at some point. When the first computers arrived, they were indeed new. But today, the media that we call new, we call them new because we want to emphasize their positive potential for progress, for always bringing things to us at a better, faster speed. So in a way, that is a rhetoric device, right? Calling new media new at this point is a way of distilling to us the idea that they are necessarily beneficial. So if we want to take a step back from that, if we want to think critically about the impact of digital media on our lives, on culture, and on our work as well, it's an important thing to really question that notion of newness. So as you've seen as I was presenting, a primary characteristic of what we think of as digital is of new media is that they are digital as opposed to analog. So this is something that in this course we would spend quite a bit of time thinking about. What makes an analog medium? How were media before the digital turn organized? How did they create this connection that I was talking about earlier in the presentation between two people or between a person and a machine? Or how were they conveying information from one point to the other? And what has radically changed in the way that digital media do it? That means going a little bit deeper into the history of the digital. That means going a little bit deeper into the history of how computers were invented, into the history of what actually makes the specificity of a digital media object. What is a digital file? It's code. And what is code? And how can we think of code when we can't actually touch it? Another thing we often associate with new or digital media is their interactivity. So we think of that as being very opposed to the idea of passivity. So digital media allow us to click things, to follow links, to input our own content. And that is something we value a lot about them and that we talk about as being consistently new. This is also an idea that this course would challenge, in the sense that interactivity in relation to media has always existed to some extent. When I'm reading a novel on a printed, perfectly normal book, my mind wanders and I imagine the elements of the story myself. And a lot of theorists have argued that this already constitutes a fair amount of interactivity. So again, we want to be careful with sort of very simplistic definitions of new media that really seek to present them as being radically new and necessarily better. And we want to interrogate a little bit what it is that really does make them different. For instance, the fact that they are networked, and what it is that actually still makes them resemble previous media forms. So one thing that makes digital media definitely different is the fact that they rely on hypertextuality. That means that they are not linear. What I mean by this is that if you open a web page, you're going to, in the text, have a lot of links to different places. This is a very novel way of organizing information in a branching kind of way. And that is very, very specific to new media. And it has brought with it a lot of transformations. And of course, the very important aspect of new media is that they are networked. So all of our computers are connected to the internet. And by being connected to the internet, they create the internet. The internet relies on the machines that support it. There is no centralized part to the internet, and that makes its strength. So this is something that is very, very specific about new media. Finally, also this idea that new media create a sense of virtuality, that they allow us to imagine different worlds that we cannot conceive of otherwise, and they allow us to visit those worlds, and they potentially allow us to live a life outside of our embodied self. And so what that brings with it, and what that brings is the idea of a simulated reality. So something that we would think of as not being authentic or not being real, something that is intangible. And so here we would be asking what some of the implications of that are. Chanel, how am I doing for time?
It is 11:45 right now.
Yes, and so that's 5 more minutes, or?
Yes, it's until noon.
Until noon, actually. Okay.
But there is, so the question period is included in that.
Okay,
so if you want to leave a little couple minutes at the end.
Sounds good. All right, sounds great. Just to have a sense. Excellent. So here's a way of summarizing again what some of the working definitions are that we would be working with in this class. So we would think of as analog older forms of media that are not digitized. That means they haven't been translated to computer code, or they haven't been created by a computer. So older or analog forms of media would be books, they would be records, they would be photographs that were taken with an analog camera and developed in a dark room, etc. These are media that we would be talking a lot about in this class because we would be using them to compare with more recent digital media that we would be defining in this way. So new or digital media as being networked, first of all, and as being able to produce, store, and distribute contents in a digital, that means a digitally encoded way. And so again, this idea that digital media as opposed to analog media, they are not continuous. They can be accessed in this nonlinear or hyperlinked way. They can be broken down into their constituent units, and that brings with it some very important implications as well. Here are some quotes from perhaps the most important early thinker of new media. This is a Russian theorist who moved to the United States in the 1980s. And in the early 2000s, he wrote this book called The Language of New Media, which up to this day kind of remains a sort of a Bible, if you will, to understand what makes new media new media. And so he talks about this very rapid transformation of culture in the 1990s when new media emerged. And he really interrogates what that would have meant for culture to undergo this very radical shift. So again, what we're going to do in this class is to really think about the magnitude of this shift, which is difficult for us to do, especially if we were born after that period and we've only ever known the world with its media components and the way they present themselves to us today. So what this course does is to really invite us to think critically about what new media are, what that newness actually is. Is it always all that new? Are there some parallels that we can trace with earlier forms of media? And where does that lead us? What does it lead us to think about the world that we live in today? That's a two-way process, really. So basically, what we discover in this class is that the meanings and functions of a medium, they are shaped over time by two different things. On the one hand, existing habits of media use. So how people use the media that are at their disposal. Versus people's shared desires for the technologies that they receive. So they're kind of imagined uses of the media that they have. And that's going to have an impact on how media come to shape society. So these two different poles, how people already use media versus how people want to be using them, what they discover they can do with media. Perhaps you get a medium that was designed for one purpose, but you imagine different purposes for it. And that sort of shift, that is what then also has a giant impact on how media are being used. So in this class, we adopt what is called a historical perspective on the new, which means that we're situating back in time what it meant at a specific moment for something to be new, how that newness was being thought of. And that helps us to recognize, first of all, that at any point in time, any medium was new. When the printing press was invented in the 15th century, it was new. People had not been confronted to printed books before, and it completely changed the way that information was circulating in the world. When photography and film were invented, they were completely new. And again, they changed the way that people thought of images and how information could be circulated, how you could have actual testimonies, visual testimonies to things that were happening, that were going on. So new media inscribed themselves into a long history of media emerging at different points in time and being considered as new. Also, media, when they are first invented, do not come fully formed. So somebody creates this new medium, or a range of people usually are working on this at the same time, and then the public seizes it and sees the potential of it and begins to really think about what to do with this medium. And then that in turn is going to shape that medium. It's going to shape its potential. It's going to shape its capacities. And then that is going to have an impact on society as we know it. So the characteristics of media, their functions, and also their cultural significations, they are all elaborated by individuals such as you or I, but also communities and institutions over time. And this is really something that is very crucial to understand when we really want to dig deeper into the potential of media. So to put it very briefly, the meaning of media is always in flux. You cannot say, oh, the computer is this, or the photograph does that. The meaning of media is always dependent on the social conditions they're being used under, the political conditions they're being used under, and again, that is also going to have an impact on those very conditions. So that's what I mean by a two-way process, right? So I'm going to stop here for today. I hope that this gives you a little bit of a sense of the sort of material that we would be covering in a class like this. This is an introductory class, so it has a 1000 number, which means that technically speaking, it is a first-year class at St. Paul. But people would take it at different points of their trajectory through the program. But that is what we call a more theoretical class. So that is a class that is really interested in giving you more background, more in-depth knowledge of the history of the media that you are using.